Well, hi there. I'm here today with some mourning geckos. But before I talk too much about them, I want to tell you about my experience with crested geckos. I love crested geckos, and my first ever crested gecko that I got was a female. And that was really exciting, and after I had her for a little bit, I was like, I love these guys, and I want to start breeding crested geckos. And so I bought a male, and then I decided I wanted to get maybe a few more females to have a colony big enough that I could breed them for a few generations. And so I bought next a sexed female, who when she grew up turned out to be a male. And then I bought a whole series of babies after that, and they all grew up into males. And it really wasn't, I managed to finally buy a few adult females, which are not inexpensive. And I bred them for a while, and I held back all my babies, and then finally I had enough females to really breed crested geckos. But it was so hard getting female crested geckos. There are lots of geckos I would like to breed. Like, I would love to breed leeches, but getting a pair that get along, that can be really challenging. Well, that is not a problem with these guys. Or should I say, with these gals. I don't know if I can tell you how much I love and appreciate mourning geckos. They're just adorable, wonderful little souls that no one could dislike. I don't care how afraid you are of reptiles. Mourning geckos are just pure joy. And, they're really cute. They've got a very, very traditional gecko body plan, which I love the gecko body plan. Really, they're very cryptically colored, kind of brown with some spots, but it's really just appropriate and fitting, and they've just got the greatest little personalities. They're pretty darn non-aggressive towards one another. You can actually have a big colony of them. They're all genetically identical, and they're just coming out of the woodworks. You put a food cup in there and they just come down. They're not afraid of you. They're personable. I don't know how a little gecko could be any more endearing. And on top of that, they're the gift that keeps on giving, because if you've got a couple of them, after a year or two, you have a good-sized colony. These are possibly the easiest gecko of them all to both keep and to breed. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that, at least in the pet trade, all of the mourning geckos that there are female. And that's also all you need. As it turns out, reproducing sexually stinks. I bet you didn't know that, because so many organisms do reproduce sexually. But it's the worst, and it's the worst for two big reasons. One of them is you've got to find a mate. And that can be really hard. It can be really hard to find a mate, and it's dangerous, right? If you're wandering around looking for a mate, and then you come upon one, and she grabs you and eats your head off, like what happens to praying mantis males, it's dangerous. Not to mention the fact you might have gotten eaten by something else while you were looking for her, and what happens if you don't find her? What if you're alone on a desert island? Like if you've ever seen the movie Castaway, you remember when he had a kid? Me either. Because you can't when you're all by yourself on a desert island. Unless you can reproduce all alone. And that is what parthenogenetic geckos like these can do. They can reproduce all by themselves, which has another benefit, because the other problem with reproducing sexually is you only pass on half of your genes to each of your offspring. Not these guys, they make clones. 100% of their genes get passed on to their offspring. Reproducing asexually is the best. Of course, there is the downside that all of your offspring are pretty much just like you, and all of their offspring are pretty much just like you, and if the environment ever changes in a way that's bad for you, it's bad for all of you. And so these sorts of lineages do tend to be sort of a temporary blip on the radar, but for while they exist, they're awesome, and we should love them because they're here now. As I already mentioned, these are easy to keep and clearly easy to breed, but there's more to life than just being easy to make and easy to keep alive. And that is why we need to answer the question, is the mourning gecko, as glorious and wonderful as they are, the best pet lizard for you? To help you figure this out, we have scored the mourning gecko based on our 5 categories, which are handleability, care, hardiness, availability, and upfront costs. When it comes to handleability, we give the Mourning Gecko a score of 1 out of 5. They're not good for handling. I did have a hypothesis that I could handle them, at least mine. And when we did our tour of all the animals that I have, I did handle my Mourning Geckos, and it was possible, but it's not a good idea. The problem is just that they're fast and they're easy to lose. That is really the main problem with handling Mourning Geckos. You know, not to mention the fact that they can drop their tails, they could easily be crushed, but mostly there's just a high risk they'll get away from you, and then you may never see them again. I will say that my Mourning Geckos have gotten very used to my presence. You know, I'm frequently feeding them and interacting with them while not handling them. You know, we have a lot of interaction, and they're not very afraid of my hands. And, you know, you can see when I need to transfer them between containers, sometimes they'll crawl right onto my hand, and they don't seem to be stressed out or freaked out, but I'm a little bit stressed out and freaked out because they so easily could get away from me. That said, you know, even though they're not very handleable, they are very, very personable, and I really enjoy our interactions. I mean, you know, they're fun to watch. They are not shy geckos, at least once they get used to humans being around. They're not shy at all. They're curious, and they're special. They're really special. They're so fun to watch. It's not a reptile that you're never going to see. It's not a reptile that you can't interact with. It's just a reptile where handling is a massive unnecessary risk. When it comes to care, we give the Mourning Gecko a score of 4 out of 5. The only downside that there is to these guys is that they do need fairly frequent care. It's not a lot, but it is, you know, on a regular basis. You can't just leave them alone for a week at a time. You're gonna need to do something with them every couple days at the minimum. That said, the care is extremely simple. They eat crested gecko diet and very small insects, so this might mean that you want to keep a flightless fruit fly culture, and we'll have links to those down in the description. Those are also pretty easy to maintain. I don't have one going all the time, though. I mean, you do have basically infinity fruit flies if you do it that way, and you don't have to buy new starter cultures. But, you know, periodically I'll get a culture and I'll feed them flies for a while. For the most part, they eat crested gecko diet, which is just the most wonderful food anything could eat, because you just add water to it and it's a powder. And these guys being so small, you can get the tiniest bag of crested gecko diet ever if these are your only geckos eating crested gecko diet. You know, other than that, you know, you're gonna miss them. I would mist them every day, not so much that it's wet or that it doesn't sort of dry out between mistings. This is why you're gonna need to make sure that there's decent ventilation for your enclosure, which makes it difficult to keep the babies inside. But I would miss them about every day. Every other day you can get away with that. I wouldn't go more than about 3 days though, so if you're gonna be away for longer than a weekend, either bring your geckos to somebody or have somebody come visit them who can take care of them. They shouldn't need any additional lighting or heat unless it gets very, very cold in your home. But you know, if your home stays in the low to mid 70s Fahrenheit, they're gonna be thrilled. They do great at those temperatures. The enclosure can be, and almost needs to be, very simple. And right here, I've got what I would consider to be a really good enclosure for hatchlings. I'd recommend something more in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 gallons for adults, but the hatchlings are so small that they will get out of almost any 5 to 10 gallon enclosure I've ever seen. So you need to track down the eggs, build an enclosure like this, and put those eggs in there and let them grow to adulthood in a small, tight enclosure like this. In case you don't know how to build an enclosure like this, we will actually release a full video on how we built this very enclosure with links to everything you'll need to build it this Wednesday. Let's talk about breeding these guys, you know, these ladies. If you have more than one, you will get eggs. And this is kind of a strange thing about them. They don't need a male to fertilize their eggs, but they do need somebody to come by and pretend to mate with them. That will begin the cycle of them producing eggs. If you keep one by itself, the odds are very good that it will never produce eggs, or not very regularly. However, if you have more than one, they're both going to start laying eggs very soon. The eggs are gonna be glued to something in the enclosure, and that's why I recommend putting sticks in there, especially with a lot of little nooks and holes and stuff where they can stick those eggs. The eggs are small, But for the size of the gecko, they're enormous. They're like the size of a pea, and they're very thin-shelled, so you can't move these eggs if you're gonna remove them from whatever they're stuck to. Only if you can remove like the stick that they are stuck to and try to keep them facing the same direction if you move them, say, into a new jar. If they're stuck on the side, there are things you can do. One thing you could do is you could move the parents out before those eggs hatch, which works really well unless that enclosure won't keep those babies contained because they're so tiny. In that case, what I would recommend doing is getting some sort of a small cup and kind of gluing it around the eggs. You can poke some small air holes in the cup so humidity can get in and out, but glue the cup around the eggs until the babies have hatched out, and then they'll be inside the cup, and you can remove the cup with the babies and move them into a more secure enclosure like this one. However, once you have eggs, I would just recommend you don't need to take them out and incubate them special. Just keep it in a situation so that the parents won't eat them when they hatch. As far as the care of the eggs, you take care of them just like the adults. You just keep it, humid in there, same temperatures as the adults. You just don't need to feed them, not until they hatch. The babies will be able to get out of basically any sort of a gap. And so when you're picking your enclosure for the hatchling babies, keep that in mind or you'll never see them again. I just want to say thank you to our patrons at Patreon. For those of you who are not currently supporting us at Patreon, that's okay, but we sure appreciate it. It gives us a lot of opportunity to do new things, and we try to pay it forward to you with a ton of cool features. Down in the description, we've got a link. Actually, we've got a link maybe right here too, that you can check out if you want to go see our Patreon website and a few of the things available to those of us that are our patrons. But thank you. When it comes to hardiness, we give the Mourning Gecko a score of 4 out of 5. Honestly, given proper care, and like we've said, the care is very simple, they should do great. The only reason they lose any points here is just because they're so very easy to kill. Not with proper care, but they're tiny. You could cook them. That's why I'm really not recommending a heat source unless it's absolutely necessary because it gets really cold in your house, in which case use a thermostat. But that seems like massive overkill for these guys. Maybe just try to keep that whole room a little warmer. Don't let them get dehydrated. That can kill them. But some of the bigger risks to a gecko like this is just don't smash them. Right? This can happen if you're trying to handle them. They could easily get smashed. Also, when you're closing doors and putting lids on things, just be really careful. Take your time. Go slow. If there's any resistance at all, back off and see what's causing it. Don't ever force a door closed because these guys can't handle that at all. Also, if you let them escape from you, where you lose track of them, you will probably never see them again. And so this is the key. If they get out, and if you're transferring them between containers and stuff like that, I take them, first of all, somewhere where there aren't very many places for them to hide. Someplace like, a really good place would be like a bathtub if you could really close the drain off. But somewhere where they can't immediately get lost if they get out. Because if they're like mine, they're not going to flee from you. It's just they might scurry under something. The other thing is never take your eye off the prize. This is a big one when you're herping too. You can see a lizard and you're like, okay, it's right there, and I'm just going to grab my stuff real quick, and where the heck was that lizard? It's gone. And so no matter what you need to get to, deal with that with your peripheral vision. Right? Ask for somebody to help you. Never stop looking at your gecko until it is back in its enclosure, because these guys could disappear in a hurry. But generally speaking, these guys are pretty much like keeping an insect that happens to be a gecko and can climb straight up walls and is super fast. When it comes to availability, we give the Mourning Gecko a score of 4 out of 5. These guys are obviously insanely easy to breed. And so if you know anybody with mourning geckos, they've probably got mourning geckos they could give to you. My original 2 mourning geckos actually came from my good friend Kevin. He had a big colony of them, and he gave me 2 for Christmas or my birthday, and it was a great gift, and it's the gift that keeps on giving, because now I've got a whole lot of mourning geckos, and I love them all. Because they're so easy to breed, they're available, captive bred, sometimes at pet stores, definitely online. Expos are going to have a lot of them. And if you want a whole bunch of them, just make sure you get at least 2 or 3 of them. When it comes to upfront costs, we give the Mourning Gecko a score of 5 out of 5. It's not going to get much cheaper than this. The geckos are fairly inexpensive. Seems like I've seen them as much as about $30 for one. I've also seen them like $30 for three. So they're fairly inexpensive. The enclosure almost has to be cheap because all the big expensive enclosures pretty much have gaps too big to keep mourning geckos in, especially baby mourning geckos. I mean, honestly, a 5 to 10 gallon aquarium with a sliding lid that doesn't have any big gaps is great for adults. You know, some of the front entry aquariums are going to be good for adults, but the babies are going to get through the gaps. And so honestly, the biggest jar you can find is probably the best thing you could get. I mean, if I get a 5 to 10 gallon jar, I would keep my 3 adult mourning geckos in there, and I would just get more of these jars for my others as they grow up. It'd be so cool. The food for mourning geckos is inexpensive. It's crusted gecko diet, like the smallest quantity ever, and maybe some fruit fly cultures. And we'll have links to all this down in the description. They're cheap. They're cheap to get, they're cheap to keep, they're wonderful. And that is why, overall, we give the mourning gecko a score of 3.6 out of 5, which, you know, it's a fantastic score considering how awful they are to handle. You know, they lost a lot of points there. In every other way, though, they're just amazing. If what you want is an inexpensive army of genetically identical insect geckos, then the mourning gecko is probably the best pet lizard for you. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon. You have fallen for the mourning gecko.
I love the mourning gecko. I don't know why, but I love the idea that they're so self-contained a little bit. And they just, it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Oh, like, absolutely.
So you're just a titch. A little bit more, just right at the, it's just getting worse. Oh my gosh, I gotta help you.
Why do you even have that pen if you're just gonna watch me struggle?
Yes. There you go. There it is.
Yeah.
Hey there. You gonna come out and play? Oh.
May jump on.
I wish I was so close I didn't get that backflip. That was amazing.